Firstly, Yannis, thanks for joining us on SCOTONOMICS. It's going to be a really good opportunity for us to discuss your paper that you wrote back in July, looking at the role of the central bank in supporting Europe's response to the climate crisis. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here.
A nice way for us to open this discussion is, could you start by giving our audience a quick summary of the role of the European Central Bank and how it fits into this kind of institutional framework of the Euro area, and then we'll get into a little bit more detail.
So the European Central Bank is the central bank of the Eurozone. So it means that it is the currency issuer for the Eurozone countries. It has this ability to create money and to provide this money to the economy through commercial banks. It is also the institution that has a lot of power because it governs the financial system in the Eurozone. And because it is in the Eurozone, it is also very powerful from a global perspective. Now, in terms of what the Central Bank of the Eurozone does in practice, I mean, first of all, it has a mandate to achieve price stability. So when we refer to price stability, we refer to this idea that the central banks should try to control inflation in the economy. For the European Central Bank, it means that whenever inflation is not very close to 2%, they need to do something in order to bring it back to 2%. And in most cases, what they do is that they change interest rates. So they announce new interest rates on a very regular basis. And based on this tool, and by also managing what they call inflation expectations, they try to control inflation in the economy. Let me say that there is a lot of debate on whether the ECB can actually do that successfully, but we'll get back to this later. And the other thing that the European Central Bank does is that it has a responsibility for financial stability overall in the Eurozone. I mean, we have national authorities that try to deal with financial stability, and they deal with financial regulation. But the European Central Bank has a kind of a broader role to check financial regulations in different countries, to guide financial regulation. And we have what we call macroprudential approach nowadays in central banking, which means that the central banks have this macro way of supervising the financial system. Again, there's a lot of debate on whether the ECB does this properly, on whether they have the right conceptual ideas in order to do that, but this is part of the role of the ECB. Now, what is also important is that the ECB, as part of what we call its secondary mandate, has to support the government policies of the Eurozone countries. And this is very important also in the context of the climate crisis, because as we might have the chance to discuss later, if we have governments that have as a target to achieve net zero, let's say 2050 or so, and then we have that the ECB does not do something in order to support this target, then there might be a problem with respect to this secondary mandate. And over the last few years, the ECB has recognized that. And this is why they have done some work on climate, because they have recognized that as part of their secondary mandate, they need to look into climate. They cannot ignore climate as they did in the past. So this is a broader role of the ECB. And one final point that I would like to make is that the role of the ECB became extremely political and clear during the Eurozone crisis, when we had that there was a big problem in the government bond markets, and the way that the ECB tried to address some problems there reflect political views that we have in the Eurozone. So it's very important to always highlight this political role that the ECB plays and the implications that this political role has for the lives of many people in the Eurozone.
Is the ECB in its mandate, is it different in any kind of substantial way from other central banks?
I would say that it's pretty much the same across the global north. We have significant differences when we look at the mandates of central banks in the global south, where, for instance, in many cases, there's a specific emphasis on achieving sustainable development, which means that central banks in the global south, in many cases, have more room to do innovative things and to support development in the economy. So this is one difference compared to the global north. When we look at the global north, perhaps one difference is that the ECB focuses basically exclusively on price stability, while, for instance, the Fed has also a target about interest rates and employment. So they need to support full employment. We don't have that in the case of the ECB. But I would say that across the global north, and right now also quite a lot in countries in the global south, that try to copy this model of central banking, inflation targeting is considered to be the most important thing that central banks have to do. So I wouldn't say that there are significant differences, but in my view, there are things that we can learn from some central banks in the global south, where there is more emphasis on development, because this gives much more flexibility to central banks to play a more active role also in the context of the net zero transition.
Yeah, and I'll just highlight that no part of the mandate says anything about full employment is certainly different from the approach that we have in the Fed, and it'll be interesting to get into some of the details about what the ECB could be doing, looking at some of the examples that you've said from the global south. So let's just look at the kind of up until now, what role has the ECB played in kind of supporting climate action? Because it's actually, we actually start from a position where they have been doing something. This isn't a saying you've been doing nothing, what are you going to do now? But they have been active and in some way in this kind of support for climate action. So would you like to just kind of, probably just be briefly describe what they've been doing up until now?
Yeah, so what is interesting is that before 2020, the ECB was not interested in climate. So Mario Draghi didn't actually engage with the climate agenda. And I think to a great extent, this changed when Christine Lagarde joined the ECB as a president, because she had an interest in climate. Of course, at the same time, there was more pressure from external organizations, civil society organizations in particular, to the ECB to engage with the climate agenda. It was also a period, I mean, around 2020, when the Network for Greening the Financial System became more popular and increased its members. So this is a network of central banks around the world that focus on climate. I mean, they do some work on climate. And because of all this, I think at the end of the day, the ECB decided to engage with this agenda. I mean, it might be a little bit more complicated, but it's very interesting that initially they didn't want to do anything on climate. But now what we have is that the ECB is doing a lot of climate. I mean, there are many economists in the ECB that work on climate change. But the way that they do that, in my view, is very, let's say, defensive. It's not very proactive. So their emphasis has been on running some climate stress tests. What are these? These are exercises that central banks run in order to understand how vulnerable the financial systems are to climate risks. So, for instance, central banks want to understand what is going to happen if we have a big climate-related event, which might lead to some debt default because people cannot pay debt or companies cannot give their money back to banks. So they want to understand what might happen if we have something like this. So they try to analyze some of the implications of climate change for the financial system. They also have incorporated climate into their macro models. Not very explicitly so far. I mean, we are still very far from having, for instance, models that take into account how climate affects inflation, but they are trying to do that. So they are very happy to do things about analyzing the problem, but I would argue that they haven't done enough in order to help us address the problem. One significant exception was the corporate quantitative easing program of the ECB. So 2 years ago or so, they decided to incorporate some climate criteria into their corporate bond purchases. So first of all, what is a corporate key program? It's a program that was introduced many years ago by the ECB, also by many other central banks around the world, in order to buy bonds from the corporate sector. So there's a corporate bond market. This is where big companies go and issue some bonds, and they get money from financial markets in order, let's say, to finance some investments or some of the other activities. Now, what ECB did was to buy a lot of bonds. We are talking about a very big program in terms of its size, and because of that, the cost of borrowing for some big companies went down. So by having the ECB being one of the buyers of your bonds, you get very low interest rates. And of course, this is good because it means that you have less cost whenever you want to spend money. So what the ECB did was to say that when they buy bonds, they want to take into account the climate performance of companies. And this was quite innovative in the sense that it's the first time that they introduced criteria that depart from the very standard financial criteria they use, like, for instance, the ratings of rating agencies, or criteria about the types of coupons and all this financial stuff. I mean, they departed from that, and they said, we want to evaluate the climate performance of companies. And they use some data about emissions. Now, my view is that they could have done much, much more, because first, they focused only on some specific emissions data, but they didn't take into account that there are many fossil fuel companies that perhaps improve a little bit their emissions profile, but they are still fossil fuel companies. So when we wrote the report in order to analyze the program, we highlighted that there was space for the ECB to exclude some fossil fuel companies, or to start selling bonds of fossil fuel companies in order to have a much more important intervention in the market. So this is one thing that they didn't do. Another thing that they did was that they decided to restrict very much the applicability of this climate criteria. So they focused only on a very small proportion of the whole portfolio, their investments. So these are the bonds that they had to buy in order to keep the size of the portfolio at a specific level. So only very small proportion of the
so there was no looking back to see what bonds they bought already and doing anything about then. It was just simply
So which I think is a big problem, because you really don't change the structure of the market.
It was a kind of summary, and you said, I think you said that so far they've been tinkering around the edges, and I like to use the phrase flicking a pea at a charging rhino. And that's kind of what I looked at in terms of the central bank trying to interfere in a positive way to impact the climate crisis, or the reactions to the climate crisis. It was like flicking a pea at a charging rhino. It was making no difference. And I think you kind of got to that similar summary there. So what specific actions would you like to see if there was a kind of true, let's say, again, to use your word, a kind of climate paradigm shift in central banking? What are those changes, firstly? And then what do you see as the barriers to those changes? So two very specific but related questions there.
So I think first we need to see the ECB accepting the new reality of climate change. And the new reality of climate change has, I would say, three specific aspects that are important for the ECB. So the first one is that the ECB should accept that they cannot control inflation. They can't have an impact on inflation, but it's very difficult to control inflation. There is a debate on whether they could do that in the past, but I think with the climate crisis, it's very clear that it will be very difficult for them to control inflation. Because of all these climate-related events that are going to affect the supply.
Just to summarize for the audience, just to make sure that you're saying that they normally use interest rates to control inflation, and it's possible that didn't actually work. But considering the inflation that's likely come via the climate crisis, trying to use that lever is really, really unlikely to control the inflation limit that they've set themselves of that around about that 2%.
Yeah, I mean, you have that there are big shocks to, let's say, to the food supply chain, and then which can also be outside your country, and then you just say we're going to increase interest rates to reduce consumer demand in the UK in order to control that. I mean, it can have an impact, but it will also have distributional effect, and which means that some people will have to pay more for their mortgages. Companies, SMEs might lose access to financing. So we also need to consider this. And of course, if they increase interest rates very, very much, they might have an impact on inflation, but this will not address the causes of inflation. So what I mean is that we have to accept that this is the reality, and then we have that there are some other tools that the government can use. I mean, Isabella Weber has talked so much about having caps on prices. We have some policies that have been used in the past. I mean, tax policies or product market competition policies that governments can use in order to help addressing the inflation problem. So what I'm saying is that the ECB has to accept that, we need fiscal monetary policy coordination on dealing with inflation. That's it. I mean,
yeah. So that's the first one, that kind of inflation, and the other two.
Yeah. So the second one is accepting the fact that what we discussed before, the ECB cannot be market neutral and shouldn't be market neutral. They need to focus on. They need to accept that they cannot be market neutral and focus on supporting climate neutrality. In practice, this means that they have to incorporate climate criteria into several tools. I'm not going to go into details, but these include, for instance, corporate asset purchases, refinancing operations. This refers to the way that they give money to commercial banks. They can incentivize commercial banks to support more climate-friendly activities. So they have to incorporate all these climate targets into their tools. And the third thing that is important is to change the way that they think about their own economy. There is a specific way of thinking about central banking among mainstream macroeconomies that is reflected in central banking quite a lot. And this is that overall, monetary and financial policies by central banks do not affect the economy in the long run. They can affect inflation, they can have some impacts in the short run, but they say that it's not our job to think about the long run. But the climate crisis is about the long run. And we know from Keynes that the long run is a result of short-run development. We cannot separate the short run from the long run. So if we have that the central banks accept that through their policies, change the structure of the economy, affect specific types of investment, they also have an impact on the long run. And in the context of the climate crisis, is very important. And to give you one example, nowadays that we have high interest rates, it's more difficult for having investments in renewables. The investments in renewables are very sensitive to interest rates because we need to have more upfront investment. So central banks actually create a problem to this transition. In the long run, we want to have a renewable energy infrastructure. If central banks don't help us to achieve this, they are not neutral in the long. So it's another thing that central banks have to change. I'm focusing on the way that we think about central banks, because if we don't change that, it's very difficult to have changes in policy tools. So for me, this is the starting point. And if we have this new way of thinking about the role of central banks, it's straightforward to incorporate this way of thinking into policy tools. Then we will have to focus on some technical details, but I think this will not be so difficult.
And that's the paradigm shift we're talking about, isn't it? And our listeners will be aware of our work on our kind of growth paradigm and our austerity paradigm, which just basically says if you believe all of these things, then these types of policies come out of it. And I think this is a perfect application when we're looking at the ECB. If you follow all of those assumptions that, growth is good, leave it to the market, governments kind of need to get out of the way, you need to listen to economic advice above everyone else's, then if you follow those, then all these natural policies come out, don't they? Like, interest rates affect the economy. It's okay if savers earn more money than borrowers. That's fine. We're not worried about inequality. We're worried about efficiency. So it's that whole kind of like paradigm shift from where we are now to where we need to be. And then when you've done that, as you said, the policies become a bit more natural, don't they? Then you can kind of concentrate in a much easier way. So we're absolutely bang on the same page with the idea of a new paradigm. But looking at the three issues that you highlighted earlier, you're just basically saying, hey, central bank, get out of the way. You don't really have anywhere near the type of authority that you thought you did. You're actually pretty weak in terms of your impact of the economy. So we're just going to take all the power off you or expect you to do something else. I would imagine the ECB and the economists and the whole kind of framework wouldn't be particularly supportive of that. So that takes us to barriers to these ideas. Yannis, do you want to give us a bit of detail?
I think there are ideological barriers and political economic barriers. In the case of the central banks, I think the ideological barriers are quite important. Why? Because most economists who work in central banks have a very way of thinking about the economy. So they very much believe that central banks should be politically neutral, market neutral. They should focus on inflation targeting. So telling these economies that you have to change your way of thinking about central banks is very difficult to lead to a positive outcome. Why? Because they have a specific education about economics. They stick to that. They believe very much in this. So I think this is extremely difficult to change. So if, for example, you talk to an economist from the Bundesbank saying that, it's not possible for the central banks to control inflation, I think they will react in a very negative way to that. And this is a case also, of course, for people who have power in the central banks, not only the economists that work there, it's also the whole system. And now, one way to change that is to have people in power, being, for instance, presidents or in the executive board of the ECB or the governing council who have different ideas. And I think this worked a little bit with climate. So some people who had very strong views about climate joined the ECB, and they had power, and this is why we saw some changes, I think. So this is one way to deal with that. And of course, another way is to work on how we train economists nowadays. I think economists have a very specific way of thinking about the macroeconomy. It goes back to Friedman to a great extent, and it has been very difficult to change this. The other type of barrier is about the political economy. For instance, if we are talking about having a program that incorporates climate criteria and excludes specific fossil fuel companies, of course, this will have a lot of resistance. Why? Because financial institutions right now get money by providing finance to fossil fuel companies. In the long run, someone could say that they would benefit if we change the whole model because the whole system will become more stable. But right now, they don't want to see a change. They want to continue getting money from that. And if you have that the central bank becomes too interventionist, this is how they think about that, and affects their profits and affects their opportunities in terms of getting profits, I think they of course they wouldn't like this. But what I also argue in the paper is that this might change gradually. Why? Because unfortunately the climate crisis is deepening. We are seeing the effects of all these climate-related events. And I think there will be more pressure on everyone, including the central bank, to be more decisive. But this will not happen easily. We need to change the way of thinking about the economy. And we also need to change the distribution of power. Because nowadays finance is too powerful, and private finance has also an impact on how central banks work, what tools they use, and so on.
It's the kind of undemocratic nature of finance as well, which is a huge concern, and the fact that it's so powerful but it's not interested in efficacy, which I think is a key takeaway from this conversation so far, and it's certainly not interested in justice. Well, what do you say to people who would argue with you there and say actually markets will sort this out, and one of the ways that will do that by making sure we've got the correct price for carbon, and we're incentivizing and we're subsidizing the market can kind of, although subsidies tend to be government led, but the market can sort this out. What would you say to people? Where's the evidence that just won't work?
The first thing that I would say is that there's no evidence that this has happened over the last 20, 25 years that we're talking about climate change. And I think even mainstream economists have said that, climate change is the big market failure, in the sense that markets didn't manage to deal with that. But the second thing is that at the end of the day, what is profitable and what is not is determined by government interventions. And what we have right now is that the financial sector wants, in principle, to support the climate economy. This is the narrative that they use. But that what they ask from governments to do is de-risking, right? They ask governments to help them to get more profits if they invest in climate, in any climate activity. And this means that without government intervention, they are not willing to do more in order to achieve profits and help the economy. They want to get enough intervention from the government in a way that suits them in order to do something that is good for climate.
The de-risking narrative, isn't it, that supports all of this stuff?
Yeah, exactly. And this is what Daniela Gabor has explained over the last years, that we have that the private sector now sees this climate as an opportunity to get more profits. They want to convince governments that have some fiscal constraints based on the current structure of the global financial system. They want to convince these governments to give them enough financial incentives to invest in climate. Now, is it how markets are going to solve the problem? I don't think so. Right, because first, this is not going to solve the problem, because in many cases these investments are not in the direction that we need, because their main purpose is to ensure high profits and low risk for the private sector, and this in many cases can be inconsistent with what society needs or a local population needs. And second, if we say that the government has to intervene and provide support to the markets, I mean, it's clear that markets by themselves cannot solve the problem.
Our policymakers think of markets as this kind of thing that arrived from space, which they can't have any influence over. And I think that's really important, is to say exactly that. If you're calling for the markets, then by definition, a market is constrained by the government, or set up by the government, or influenced by the government. So there can be a role for markets, but it's probably a market that has much more government control in terms of trying to develop these things. And as you said, the private businesses are just looking for this as another way to de-risk and to provide the profits. So there's huge issues there when we're going forward. I wanted to just get your thoughts on growth and this kind of principle that underpins not just the ECB, but, you know, you could say the European Union, or you could say capitalism, or the global north, or whoever. But what's your thoughts on economic growth, and how does this align to the work you've been doing at looking at the climate mitigation of the ECB?
Yeah, so I think it's clear that the more growth we have, the more difficult it is to address the climate problem. I mean, I have worked quite a lot on projections and modeling of global warming and how we can reduce global warming using different types of policies. If you have high growth, it becomes more difficult. Why? Because for a given carbon intensity of the economy, the more you grow, the more you generate carbon emissions, and the problem becomes even more complicated when you include biodiversity, water stress, land use, and so on. Now, I think it's important to focus on the fact that in the global north, we have very high levels of consumption that are bad for the environment. So it's important to make this distinction between the global north and the global south, because in the global south, there is the need for development, and this includes growth. And there's also a different historical responsibility in terms of the climate crisis. But the global north needs to change the consumption patterns. So I think we need to have interventions in terms of that. We need to recognize that, yes, what we care is full employment, low inequalities, low poverty, well-being. Growth, in some cases, can be a way to achieve that in a specific stage of the development process. But if we just focus on growth, of course, this is a problem, and it has these issues with the environment. In practice, my view is that dealing with consumption is part of the policy tools that we have to use. So we need to use tools that reduce the consumption of rich people, for instance, which is to have a very high carbon footprint. And central banks do not have perhaps a direct role to play in terms of that. But it's very important, in my view, to introduce these ideas into their conceptual frameworks and into their modeling exercises, and to support whatever the government does. Because someone could say that if central banks try to reduce, let's say, growth, this can have a lot of side effects, because they might increase interest rates too much, they might reduce some limits in terms of credit provision. And I think this is a little bit complicated. My preference would be for the government to lead the process, and for central banks to support using specific tools maybe, but I don't think that they have the key role to play in terms of changing our consumption pattern.
And let's get back to specifics in your paper then. You discussing the ECB's role in kind of climate adaptation and kind of loss management. You propose that the central bank could act as a climate rescuer of last resort. I think that's a direct quote that I've pulled out. Can you explain what you mean by that and how that would work?
Yes, so this is a term that was first used, if I'm right, from a paper from BIS, the Green Swan, about climate change. I have used this in a more precise way in the paper. So my main concern is the following. Assume that in the coming years we don't address the climate problem, and in the case of Eurozone we have more frequent and more severe droughts, floods, wildfires, let's say in Mediterranean countries, and then you have that governments have to step in and provide financial support to people who are suffering, who will suffer from all these climate events, and then the public debt increases. And if this happens, then we might have the repetition of the Eurozone crisis, but in a much more permanent way. I mean, this will not be just 1 year event. Every year will be worse. So what is my concern is that within the current institutional framework of the Eurozone, then credit rating agencies are going to downgrade these countries, the governments of these countries, and then it will not be possible for countries to implement fiscal policy. So what I'm saying is that if we recognize that this is a systemic problem, in any case, it's not the responsibility of countries that they have that. Of course, they contribute to climate change, but in isolation, these countries have a very small contribution to the problem. We have to deal with this by saying that the ECB will be ready to buy government bonds to stabilize the bond markets. If they don't do that, we will have new crises continuously. And I don't think that this is sustainable. So if nothing else changes and we still have this framework in the Eurozone, I don't want to go into the broader debate about what is the right framework for the Eurozone, but if we still have the ECB representing all these countries, I think it's necessary to have a tool. Markets should know about this tool. Credit rating agencies should know about this tool. Otherwise, things will become extremely difficult for specific countries. And this will have a very significant effect, of course, on the lives of many people.
That sounds like just effectively taking that risk off the balance sheet of the countries so that it doesn't affect their kind of financial stability in terms of the financial markets and borrowers and things like that. Okay, I've got two final questions for you. One of them is an easy one, and then the other one is a very difficult one. And I didn't warn you about the last one. So the easy one: how appropriate is the sustainable growth? And no, it's not sustainable growth. What is it? The SGB Pact in Europe, the 3% deficit and the 60% debt to GDP. What's it called? The Stability and Growth Pact. That's it. How appropriate is the Stability and Growth Pact, considering everything we've been talking about so far?
Yeah, that's a new one. It's not appropriate. This is my short answer. I mean, simply because we need to invest a lot now in climate mitigation, climate adaptation. If we have a 3% target, we cannot do that. I mean, we always need to have more taxes in principle to support more spending. And I think, again, if you adopt a long-run perspective, what you really want to do is to invest quite a lot right now in the short run, perhaps increase your deficit to, of course, above the limit. Perhaps increase your public debt right now in order to stabilize your economy in the long run. So I think this framework is a straitjacket that doesn't allow us to act properly. So I think we need a much more flexible approach, which looks at how the whole system works and doesn't have embedded this ideology that we don't want to have high deficits.
You could be having the conversation and saying to people that if we had these fiscal rules, it's likely that there'd be something like 10% deficit rather than 3% deficit, and just an understanding that the government is going to have to spend a huge amount of money to start supporting the climate adaptation mitigation. But this idea that we can do that with such a short amount of extra spending in the economy would be a challenge. That's certainly my perspective on that. I know it's difficult to put kind of a figure on it, but what I say to people is they need to consider that a double-digit deficit is not a bad thing, and that's probably likely if we genuinely want to solve these problems.
Yeah, and just to say that there are different ways of developing a different framework. For instance, some people are talking about making a distinction between investment and other types of spending. But I think there's a way to do that. But one big problem with respect to this is that the global financial architecture doesn't allow countries to easily do that. This is a problem because whenever we have an increase in deficit in a country in the eurozone, of course, within the current distribution of power and within the current financial architecture, there's the reaction that creates a problem. So I think it's both that the eurozone has to change its approach, but we also need to have some new institutions at the global level that do not penalize countries that try to do the right thing in terms of investment policy.
Yeah, absolutely. A really important point here. Okay, right. You ready for the difficult question? Well, we're now having this conversation and we're talking about an independent Scotland, and it's 2030, and we're looking to set up a new central bank from scratch. How would you suggest that this institution would differ from a standard institution, standard central bank like the ECB or the Bank of England? What should we do differently?
Yeah, if you're going to develop, if you have the room to develop a central bank from scratch and have some new ideas that correspond to the new realities, I think I would get back to some of the points that I made before. So for me, first of all, it's important to look at what is happening around the world, not to try and copy and paste some of the models that we have right now in the global north. In my view, these models are not consistent with the new realities that we are facing in any case. So the first thing I will say is look at different kinds of central banks. Now, in my view, fiscal monetary policy coordination is important. You need an institutional framework that makes this possible. And so within this framework, there should be some clarity in terms of the targets of the central bank. What are the primary or secondary targets and connection with tools? But there should be some flexibility because fiscal and monetary policy coordination is challenging in practice and requires coordination. It's not like a simple model where you say inflation goes up, I just increase interest rates. So I think it's important to work on an institutional framework that makes this coordination effective. And the other thing that I would say is that there should be a lot of thought about how to respond to pressures from global financial markets. I mean, we live in a world whereby global financial markets have power. And sometimes there are countries that want to do stuff that is important for their economy, for people. But then financial markets react in a way that, for instance, causes depreciations, which can have implications for inflation, or causes problems in terms of the government bond markets. And I think it's important to have a strategy about that, because if you do this and you don't consider these restrictions, it's very possible that there will be a kind of a big financial shock that will also affect the perception of people about what the central bank has to do.
Yeah, no, but an example of that would be that, if the central bank had loads of outstanding debt in a foreign currency, for example, that would be an exceptionally risky position to be in, concerned to having most of its debt in the domestic denominated currency. As an example, these things are important for you to consider and think about.
You need to think very carefully about your external position, of course. My view is that it's also very important to make connections with industrial policy. Why? Because if you have a strong current account balance, which means that you have a lot of exports compared to imports, I mean, this is one of the key drivers of that, then you don't need to rely so much on imports from other countries, which create complications with respect to the currency. So it's very important to connect the industrial policy with the central banking policy. Otherwise, at some point there will be a problem with respect to that, because you might say that I don't want to have foreign denominated debt, but at some point it might be difficult not to do that, again, because of all the restrictions the financial markets place on the economy. And I think building a strong economy, which requires a lot of investment, is a way to do that gradually in the long run, but it's also very important to have a very clear plan in the short run. So I would say that there are a lot of complications. I mean, I want to be pragmatic. Okay, I don't want to say that there is an easy way to develop a central bank that will have a lot of autonomy to do what works for people within the current system.
Yeah.
But there is a lot of room to do innovative things, to follow your own way of doing central banking. You just need to consider these constraints and work based on the fact that these constraints exist. Because ideally, we would like to see more global coordination on how we can deal with all these challenges that we are talking about. And I have also written quite a lot on the global coordination in the financial system that is necessary for dealing with the climate crisis. And I think it's also very important for the central bank to create pressure on these global discussions. So it's also important not to focus on what will be good for your country, but also what is good globally to have, because at the end of the day, this will also be good for Scotland.
Kind of summarize there, I think that we're talking about, if you want a new institution and you want it to do new things, we really need to be talking about this new paradigm, and we have to look at what are the new ideas for this new reality. And the idea that we can just kind of grandfather institutions and start from where they are now, I think kind of practically puts you at least, if not a generation, a decade behind where you should be. And if you've got the opportunity to create new institutions and you have developed a new paradigm, then there are huge amounts of potential in these new institutions. But if a central bank is just doing what it's trying to do at the moment, then we'll have missed a really big opportunity.
Just to say that sometimes when, for instance, I talk to people who work in central banks in the global south, I see this way of thinking that they try to copy and paste to what the high-income countries do. And I think it's a big mistake. And the starting point should be, let's think about the new ideas. Let's interact with people who understand the new realities, and not to and understand that all these central banking ideas, in my view, are right now outdated. So we need something new. It's very difficult to change that all in the global south. I mean, there are some innovative people, central banks that try to do different things and understand also these problems in the global north. But once you have that, I think you restrict so much the possibilities. So I would say that this should be the starting point. And then that, in my view, it's very important also to work quite a lot on the technical details. Sometimes there are great ideas, but people don't spend enough time to think about technical details, different scenarios. And then a very good idea actually is unsuccessful because of that. So it requires a lot of preparation. It is very important to try to anticipate what might happen.
Fantastic. Yannis, thank you so much. That was a wonderful discussion. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks a lot. It was my pleasure.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for comments and watching the show this evening. I just thought I'd come on to say that. You might be able to tell I'm not feeling well at all. Sorry, I'm not able to go through things in a bit more detail like we normally do. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next week. We have a show covering Scotland's just transition, an interview from the Festival of Economics that we did with Miri and Brett. Hopefully, I'll see you then. Hopefully, I'll be feeling better. We'll see you next week. Thanks for joining us. Bye for now.